Welcome back to the Purple Political Breakdown. How's it going? How's your day been? We're back at it again. Ladies and gentlemen, today's podcast episode, we have an excellent guest to talk about protesting as well as his organization, because I do find it interesting after I looked into it. And this is a big topic of conversation in particular, considering all the protests that have been happening recently, especially under this regime and actually before this regime too. So there's a lot of nuances that is worthwhile diving into. So with that said, Adam, can you introduce yourself? Who are you? What are you about? And why are you here today?
Hey, great to be with you, first of all, and with your audience, of course. My name is Adam Swart, probably best known for being founder and CEO of Crowds on Demand. We are the country's largest protest company. We're known for organizing protests, but we also organize advocacy campaigns, like comprehensive campaigns to get policy changes done, resolve business disputes, get attention for things, companies, and provide audiences and a bunch of other stuff. So that's what we do. That's probably why I'm on the show. And a bit about the company. We started about 13, 14 years ago, and I've been at it ever since. And I started in college, and I've really been growing it and maturing the business.
All right, excellent. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this company is and what it does in particular so people have a good insight about that?
Yeah, so a little bit about the company. Um, we basically again specialize in outside the box type efforts, right? So one, okay, our services aren't cheap, but we're often hired kind of in an oppositional capacity. For example, by startups, by like smaller, medium sized companies against large behemoths, by smaller interests against major lobby groups that have bought off all of Congress, right? We know how kind of corrupt and crony the system is. One of the beautiful things about living in the United States of America is they can't take away our right to protest, right? So we have the right to, of course, legally, peacefully, within the bounds of the local ordinances, but we have the right to protest. So it's a beautiful thing, whether it's on behalf of a business or a cause, that you can actually do this. And we work all across the country.
I think what I respect about your organization, from what I saw when I looked into it very briefly, is the willingness to advocate for any side that probably has a just cause for the most part. I saw one where you were just helping a individual kind of advocate for their own individual rights regarding race or discrimination.
Yeah.
And then you could say the same thing for the side on the right. Can you give us those both examples in a little bit more details, because sometimes people get blackpilled in terms of the current bipartisan divide and the
Yeah.
current toxic nature. So let's kind of provide more nuance on what you guys are about.
That's a great point, and we are nonpartisan, as you very correctly and astutely pointed out. We are not affiliated with Democrats or Republicans. We will work with both sides, either side, on issues that are kind of common sense. But actually, a lot of what we do, a lot of people don't realize a lot of what we do has nothing to do with politics. Now, I guess these are issues that sort of touch politics. You mentioned that we've helped people involved in discrimination battles. This has included multiple very successful Black entrepreneurs who have been facing institutionalized discrimination, basically not asking for special treatment, but actually they were getting worse treatment on account of their skin color, right? And these are people who just said, "Hey, I just want a seat at the table," right? And part of it is that the legal system, the courts, or the governmental systems are really rigged against a lot of entrepreneurs, especially Black entrepreneurs. So we were able to help these people through the power of protest and their power of public opinion get a seat at the table, metaphorically speaking, with huge success. But it's not just Black communities. We've advocated on LGBT rights issues and scored kind of, I would say, multi-billion-dollar effect in terms of LGBT rights, stopping discrimination against gay people or the broader LGBT community by certain insurance companies. So we've definitely worked that with on those. Now people would sort of say, oh, well, those are issues of minority rights, so they're on the left. I don't consider those left-wing causes. I think equal rights are something that conservatives should get behind. I think when we're talking about the left is saying I want better treatment, right? Our clients, one of the black entrepreneurs that I was referring to was actually a huge Trump supporter, right? But he just wanted the same treatment. He didn't want any better treatment, you know. Now, of course, we've worked with conservatives as well, conservative causes. And we're proud of that work. Some of that is included getting pieces of energy infrastructure approved, you know, to stop power blackouts, right? And you need to kind of wind all of that through sort of a complex system of hearings, and we do that pretty effectively. So we have a long history of getting a lot of this stuff done.
And I like that because ultimately, even though we're kind of in the current situation we are right now, the idea of America should always be focusing on helping the people, especially considering there's a lot of powerful entities in specific areas that have the influence as individuals to put you down. And the greatest
Yeah.
thing about protesting and building protests like your group is doing is it makes the power, it puts the power into the people's hands
Yes.
over the elite. Let me just use that term. So before we
Yes.
get into the nitty gritty regarding like protesting and the do's and the don'ts, because I did see your conversation on Fox News. Can you tell us, let me humanize you a little bit. Can you tell us what makes you relatable? What makes you normal? What's a hobby you enjoy that makes you like every other person that exists?
Okay. Well, a hobby that I enjoy. I love watching TV. And I love, well, probably my biggest hobby when I'm not working is I love to play tennis, probably like a lot. I don't know whether that makes me relatable. A lot of people don't really find tennis to be the most enjoyable sport in the world. It is a healthy sport and it's fun and it is kind of a healthy amount of competition. I definitely do a lot of that. Um, I love going on long walks. Hopefully that's something that everyone should do in their lives. By the way, almost anybody, unless you're disabled, can probably take a walk, and it's one of the healthiest activities you can possibly do. So,
It is
I
for
love
sure.
long walks. I love trashy reality TV. That's probably, unfortunately, the most relatable thing that I do. I'm a ultra fan of the Real Housewives, almost all the Real Housewives.
Okay.
Um, so I enjoy that. I probably am also a little bit too much of an addict to food delivery apps, um,
Same
like
here. I'm
like
gonna be
most
honest.
of America. I definitely order probably way too much food delivery, and I always find it funny that, you know, the funniest thing about food delivery is like all these companies like Uber, they always talk this amazing game about AI and, you know, all this complex technology, and somehow it's just there's some meth head dropping off that delivers the chicken wings to the wrong house, right? Like, so all that AI and all that, and we're it's not necessarily an improvement, but at any rate, so I enjoy doing that. Obviously, I enjoy spending time with my family. I have a large family, very close knit. um I always tell people that it's good to be on good relations with their family.
Mhm.
One thing that I think actually family is a beautiful thing, because your friends you choose. You can choose friends who have the same political ideology. I mean, I'll relate this to the subject of your podcast, which is um, it's easy to choose friends who have a similar political ideology to yourself. But with family, you don't choose family, so you're going to have family members who disagree with you. And to me, I think that's an awesome thing, to have family members who disagree with you on politics. You know, if you can, and have that discussion in a respectful way, because what's great is, you know, you with family, you know, they're good people, right? Hopefully. So if
Right.
they come to a different conclusion on issue from you, you can see, hey, you know, I might not agree with you, but I really like, I still respect you as a person, right? So you take away this idea of saying this is a bad person because of their political beliefs.
I think that's very fair, and that going into these echo chambers of political thought can be very it can be very yes manish, and it's not the most healthy way to think because you can kind of go down a spiral. So having family there that hopefully you have good family members that have your best interest in mind versus only with you because of what you think, that care having the like invested interest in your well-being is something that is unmatched for sure. Real quick, I'm just gonna ask: do you follow professional tennis at all as a tennis player?
Oh, yes, very much so.
So let me ask the question: who's the men's tennis goat? Who's the women's tennis goat? Because I know the men's tennis goat in particular is a very controversial conversation with what Djokovic is doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, Djokovic is a amazing player. His tenacity. I mean, as someone, I'm 34, right? I mean, he's Djokovic is pushing 40, and to play 5 sets against the like of Alcaraz and Sinner, right, who are in their early 20s, that is no easy feat, and it's kind of amazing, honestly. So I greatly respect his tenacity. I also think with Djokovic, the other thing that I really respect with him is that he is a very respectful and generous loser, right? When he loses, it's very easy to get really frustrated when you lose. And I'm not saying that I have not done that myself.
For
You
sure.
know, and but Djokovic, I feel like is a very gracious, and that's a skill as well. It's you want to be gracious in victory, but it's almost harder to be gracious in defeat when, especially when it's close. And in any tennis match, I actually played a very tough one last night, and lost, in fact. And it's hard to want to be gracious in those moments, but especially like knowing that, oh, maybe I could have done something a little different, and played better.
Uh-huh.
So I think I really admire Djokovic, but Alcaraz, I do believe, is currently the greatest player of all time. I mean, between his ability to get to the ball and kind of make you win the point 4 or 5 times over, is pretty amazing. I think it's too early to say in terms of legends because is Alcaraz going to play another 15 years? He could, right? Or not. I don't know. Um, in women's tennis, I think it's a little bit of an easier question to me. Like I do think Serena Williams it has this like status, with like a Tom Brady, Tiger
Yeah.
Woods, right? Like
Mhm.
she's a legend, and you have to kind of note that if I asked like a normal person on the street, name one tennis player, who would they name? It'd probably be Serena Williams, right? I honestly think
100%.
you would probably name Serena Williams because is the most famous tennis player. So, in what sport is the women's more famous than the men's? Right? Only
Good point.
in tennis is the most famous tennis player of all time, Serena Williams. Now, I don't always I think Serena has very diva energy, and her attitude is not always the best, especially of late. I mean, she's retired now, but I think she knows she's a great player, and she hasn't always. I mentioned Djokovic with graciousness, so I'm not saying like I'm like the biggest fan, but of her tennis ability and her tenacity, like she's an epic player, obviously, along with her sister. So it's hard to think of another women's tennis player who could kind of come close to that, other than like if you want to go back to some of the trailblazers in women's tennis, of course. Um, but yeah, I think it would have to be Serena Williams.
All right. Hopefully, the tennis fans out there enjoyed that conversation. I agree with Serena Williams right now, and I have been hearing a lot of really good things from is it Alvarez?
Alcaraz. It's like
Alcaraz. I don't know why I
Alcaraz.
put a V there.
Oh no, it's a reasonable because in you don't really meet Alcarazes in the United States, you meet more Alvarez, right?
Mhm. Yep.
Alvarez is more like Mexican, right? And Alcaraz is Spanish, right? So I've never met an Alcaraz before, I don't think. So yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, time to get into the nitty gritty of protesting. This has been a very important conversation, especially now in the political space. I think we can point out a very potent one that you've discussed recently in regards to the ICE protests and how people are acting. So, before we kind of go into potential examples or even the overarching dialogue and how people are behaving from the administration to the people, what should people pay attention to? What should people think about before they go out to protest, go out there on the streets? And what are the biggest do's and don'ts?
Okay, well, yeah, this is a really good question. Number one is understand who else is going to be what the topic is, right? So, I mean, that's simple. But what is the topic? Do I agree with it or disagree with it? You shouldn't go out just because some friend tells you to come out, right? Why?
Mhm.
Because you're an individual and you have your own beliefs, and it's important that you understand that their beliefs might not be your beliefs. Number two, understand could my involvement, this is just like, I'm not saying this should be the case, but could my involvement in something actually end up getting me fired at my job, right? So here's a
Mhm.
good
Yeah.
example, and I'm not endorsing this because I'm the biggest opponent of cancel culture. I'm just being real with your audience, right? Let's just say you're at a Palestine rally, and maybe you're just out there saying, I want the bombing to stop and I want the war to stop, right? But there might be other people chanting far more radical slogans, right? And now you're in the crowd and you get put in with those people. Be aware that people have been fired for that. Again, I think it's absolute bullcrap. I do not support cancel culture. And I think there's a huge hypocrisy with the people on the right who've opposed cancel culture, rightfully so, when it's come from the
Mhm.
left, now supporting it on the issues of Israel or anything else, right? Like, I don't want people getting
Right.
canceled for their viewpoint. I didn't think it was appropriate in 2020 when people lost their job for critiquing, the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that's fair game. I think now people are losing their jobs for critiquing Trump. That's, to me, in a free country, that's also fair game, right? No, I think provided like the, you're making it, expressing your opinion, but to answer your question better, basically be aware of how your involvement could be construed by your employer. Number three, are there people at the protest who could be violent, or could there be any way that this could escalate, right? Because to the extent that the protest could escalate, right, this could be um a a problem for you because number one, you're next to some potentially violent protesters, right? So that's putting your safety at risk. And number two, if there are violent protesters kind of clashing with law enforcement, then that could put you at risk from tear gas or whatever from the law enforcement because they're not going to know who's violent and who's not. So it's something to be aware of when you're going out to these sorts of things for your own safety, right? So again, none of this is to say that you shouldn't go out to protest, but I like to actually let people know that I'm mostly referring here to protests that are around tense political subjects, right? Just to be aware of those factors.
Yeah, these three things are something that I agree with, especially when it comes down to being very aware of the consequences. And that's the main goal of what you're saying, because the consequences, especially right now, can be very dire to your own physical well being or your own career or the social circles that you may frequent around if they see you at a protest and create this whole overarching opinion. Understanding these consequences are valuable. With that said, I did hear something recently from when Obama was on Brian Tyler Cohen's podcast, and
Yeah.
he said, "America, this is going to be your opportunity." And he's not telling people to do anything particular, but this is the opportunity where the rights of the people are truly going to be tested when stuff like this happens. Because I'm with you. I hate cancel culture. I never liked that. I thought it was dumb all across the board. And
Yeah.
I'm even more terrified now because if the administration is willing to do something. So now there's a conversation of, okay, you protest, you might get backlash on social media, you might get some weird internet lefties going like, you can't say that, whatever. Now you have authoritarian figures that out
Correct.
there that you can engage with, and it could be very dangerous. So this is very important thing to consider in terms of like what you have to do. What are your thoughts about right now in terms of engaging with, whether it's the National Guard, whether it's ICE, just political figures in general? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I think that it's true. Unfortunately, if we don't kind of let our government know that we don't want to give up, the government rarely gives us rights. They generally only take our rights, right? So what I think we've seen over both under the first Trump administration, under Biden, and under Trump, I think Obama was the last president who I think did not try to trample on the rights of his opponents, right? And I think that it's very tempting when you are in power to be very aggravated about your opponents and to believe the worst about them and therefore try to do what you can to suppress them. But that's a very un-American idea, right? The whole idea of America is that even our opponents get to speak, right? And it's not rule by majority, it's rule of law, right? So I really was not a fan of the Biden administration, and I think that Trump has not also lived up to his promises of being the biggest free speech president. So personally, what I'd like to see is for both parties and for both parties to commit to actual free speech. And actually, this gets into a couple initiatives that I've been pushing, which is number one, I'm pushing the concept of the Protesters' Bill of Rights and Responsibilities, which is I
Okay.
want authorities and I want protest groups, advocacy groups to sign on to this idea of here's what we expect from protesters, i.e., to be nonviolent, no vandalism, don't block streets, whatever, right? And to liaise with law enforcement, but we expect law enforcement to facilitate and protect protesters on public ground, to make all attempts to, de-escalate a situation before making arrests, right? So what we saw with the ICE agents was obviously completely unacceptable. And the reason why it's unacceptable is part of it is these guys have no training in dealing with protests. So let me just kind of work you through. I know this is a long-winded answer, but let me work you
No, you're
through
fine. Go ahead.
how cops are supposed to deal with protesters. Because I've been doing this for 14 years, and I've only had good relations with police officers. What I find is the best way to deal with the police is to be extraordinarily respectful, but also to know your rights. So don't scream, I know my rights. Show you know your rights, right? Have you ever heard show, don't tell? So
Sure.
let's just say we're setting up a demonstration outside like a major convention center, right? So the police might get called. Obviously, our demonstration would be legal, right? So we'd have signs and banners and all that. Let's just say it's on behalf of some startup company that's protesting Google or whatever, right? So we are out there. The police come, right? And the police maybe say, will sometimes say, oh, can you move to the other side of the street? The conference organizers want you to move. Well, my response to them would be, no, sir, we're good where we are because we have the right to be right outside the convention center. So with all due respect, we don't need to do that, right? And let's just say, and it would never happen with us because we would never block the street, but if somebody were to block the street, typically the police officers give multiple warnings before even thinking about an arrest. Why? Because police officers, they're also called peace officers. They're there to de-escalate. The problem with the ICE agents is they have not worked to de-escalate a situation.
And I very much agree to that. There's two prongs, and I like how you're focusing on both of them in terms of the ideal behavior. In the situation regarding people, you focused on don't be violent, don't obviously vandalize. I've always been very clear: never be violent to other people, never be violent to the cops, the national guard. Even if I were to be as like good, like as bad faith as possible, whatever you want to say in terms of, oh, I think ICE is evil and I have a lot of issues with ICE, you will there's no justification for you to put your hands on them, do anything to them, because they can react to it and it's going to be very bad for you in every circumstance.
Yes.
Obviously vandalism is very bad too. I was very critical when like the BLM was happening. Most of it were peaceful protests, but the people that were going out and destroying stores, I condemned it every single time because you're not doing anything good for the cause. And I'm with you there in terms of like don't block in the streets. Of course, you could be angry, you could be up there, but try not to block the streets. Probably not good. You're probably gonna get in trouble.
And
This
you're
is one
going
of
to
the
actually hurt your own cause. That's the core of
exactly.
it, right? Is that these sorts of things. So, for example, one form of protest that is legal is you can be extremely vulgar and crude if you want, right? Like that's not against the law.
100%.
But I generally don't think it's advisable because you're turning people off. My goal, and this is like what separates crowds from men, is I'm always here to persuade people. My job is if you're on the fence about an issue, I want to persuade you. If you don't know about an issue, I want to persuade you. If you're on the other side of the issue, I want to persuade you. If I make it
100%.
harder for you to get to work, if I call you a name like a nasty insult, right? Why on earth would you give me the time of day, let alone change your mind?
100%. I wonder if you ever worked with like climate change activists that be protesting. I do see some clips here and there. I probably believe for the most part that they peacefully protest, but then you see the examples out there where they're like in the middle of a highway stopping
Yeah.
people from going to work, and I'm like, you're not convincing anybody by doing that. You're actually pissing people off and thinking you're insane when you do that. So it's just all about it is the cause, not you as an individual. You don't matter. The cause matters. So you should do everything in your power to push the cause forward. And working with the authorities, although people might have like a groan regarding that, that is actually very helpful too, because you can be on the same page with them. There have been
And
situations where the
working
police is
with
there to
does not
navigate
mean you
everything.
do
Go ahead.
everything they want you to do. That's the thing. It's having a conversation there. It's an open dialogue, right? So like I use the example of oftentimes the police will say, "Oh, could you move across the street or can you move down?" And sometimes my answer, and generally my answer is, if we don't have to do it, we're not going to do it, right?
Mhm.
That doesn't mean we don't talk to them, but we know our rights, and I'm not stupid. You know what I mean? So I understand the police might want us to do that. But an open dialogue with the police actually facilitates that. And sometimes what happens is maybe the officer is like comes in and is like, "You guys have to move," and is like yelling and screaming. And then we'll say, "Well, respectfully, we're allowed to be here. Why don't you bring your lieutenant or your captain over?" And inevitably, that higher up will remind them that we do have the right to be here. So open dialogue is not, you know, is not just like compliance, right? You see what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
I agree.
With unreasonable demands. But yeah, generally, like obviously illegal stuff is illegal and we would never do that, but even beyond the illegal, it just doesn't work, you know. Like, and you mentioned climate change. You're, I think, alluding to a group called Extinction Rebellion. This is a
Oh,
group
they had a
that's
name. I didn't realize, but yeah, go
that,
ahead.
well, a lot of the most outrageous acts are done by them. I can't be specific. I don't know whether what you're thinking of, but they've done a
Mhm.
lot of very disruptive and kind of type things to raise awareness. The thing is, every group has to make this calculus. I mean, legal issues aside, doing things that are disruptive gets a lot of attention, but it also
Yeah.
turns away a lot of people. And
Mhm.
generally, what I've found is that it's not a worthwhile trade off because if you're trying to get attention, we all know about climate change, right? Like if I were hired today to do climate change, I would put protesters outside every private jet terminal in America
Okay.
and tell the celebrities put down their jets. You know what I mean? Because the biggest obstacle to getting people on board with climate change is the fact that celebrities who are inevitably always talk about climate change all have their jets. So if I'm telling you, Riddell, don't litter, and I'm basically throwing a giant dumpster on the floor every fucking day, why on earth would I be like, Riddell, don't litter? And every day I'm throwing a big fucking dumpster out the door, right? Like Taylor Swift is filthy. You know what I mean? Beyonce, like all these people with their jets, like they are literally dumping a, dumpster every hour by their consumption of private jets. But it's not just about their consumption of the private jet. It's about the fact that they position themselves as role models on this subject. And yet the fact that they use the jets, right, is actually a is essentially used as proof that climate change doesn't exist, right? It's the same thing with
Yeah.
Barack Obama, right? President Obama, his estate in Hawaii, right? According to climate science, his estate is going to be underwater in 10 years. So it's like, why did he just build this estate in Hawaii if he must not believe it. Like, why would he build this beautiful estate that's going to be underwater in 10 years? Right. So there's a lot of stuff like that that makes people think that, oh, well, climate change isn't really real. Do you understand? Right. So if these celebrities were essentially to actually say, I'm going to fly commercial, I'm going to make a sacrifice for this cause, then I think that it would be easier to get people on board with it. But so I guess all of which to say is the Extinction Rebellion stuff, that doesn't really matter. What actually would ultimately make a difference is if you could do a movement to convince all these celebrities and political figures, to ditch their jets. Because I think if you did that, then that would actually give a lot more legitimacy to the movement, if you see what I'm saying.
I do think there can be a level of perceived hypocrisy or realized hypocrisy. Sometimes the narrative is very general and they advocate for it because it seems good without really having a strong position. And that can be frustrating because there is a lot of dialogue on the severity of climate change. I think for the most part, everybody agrees climate change exists. But is it a situation in 10 years where the Arctics are going to melt and the sea level is going to rise by a couple of feet? Or is it something that 100 years from now, the atmosphere is going to tear itself? There's a lot of confusion on it, and having better solid messaging would help not only be consistent with it, but also what you do can be also inconsistent with the principle. And that can be
hypocrisy is important. It's funny. A lot of people are like, hypocrisy is a cheap dig, because I'm a big fan of calling people out for their hypocrisy. Here's why it's not a cheap dig. If you're asking people to make a sacrifice, right, then that you are not willing to make, then it is really challenging to get people on board with that sacrifice, right? So when Jerry Falwell Jr., the televangelist moralizer, is on a boat and his wife is getting banged by the pool boy while he watches in the corner, I think that's what's happened. How legitimate do you think he is when he's talking about the need to stop adultery, right? How legitimate do you think he is? So when Bernie Sanders talks about the divide between the rich and poor, how legitimate do you think he is when he owns 3 or 4 houses, right? So the reason why it matters that Taylor Swift has a gas-guzzling jet, that Barack Obama has an estate that theoretically could be underwater according to climate change projections, the reason why all this matters is if I'm an ordinary person being asked to make a sacrifice, I feel like they're almost mocking me, right? I almost feel like they're mocking and laughing at me, trying to get me to do something that they would not do in 100 years.
Yeah, and not all the time where I see like a contradiction. Maybe it's slight, maybe it's severe, where I go like, "This is hypocritical." Because in the
Yeah,
situation, I could definitely understand that. I want to decrease the wealth inequality gap, but I'm not saying we should get rid of people to ability to accumulate wealth. You
there's
just need to
nuance.
be very
There's nuance.
there's nuance to it, and that's very important.
That's
But
very important.
be very clear with your nuance, because if someone says, Taylor, you're advocating for this, and I don't know the particulars of what actually Taylor advocates for, but if someone goes like, but what about this, and you can't answer it, that shows immediately that there is a discrepancy there. The
Correct.
authenticity is very flawed. So I'm there with you. But to
I
kind of
think the
refocus
nuance
back,
is important. I agree that I think nuance is missing. Actually, one of the things you mentioned Obama earlier as well. Like I think he actually does a pretty good job of explaining nuance, and I don't think you have enough of it. So I do appreciate that, and I think we need more leaders who are willing to say, okay, it's not a matter of like you talked about wealth equality, inequality. It's not about um, a choice between Marxism and kind of unrestricted capitalism, right? There
Mhm,
can be some sort of in between. So anyway,
right.
yeah, go on.
Yeah, I agree. So so before we move into like the authoritative figures and what they should be doing, one last thing regarding the people, because information is very valuable. So if you were to give them a quick script on, like we already went through the don't be this, don't be that. Well, what are some important knowledge they should know while they're protesting? Like, what are rights that they should like have pinned in their cell phone notes? What are resources that they should have? Like, what are some very key points of knowledge for the people when they go out to protest?
One thing is when it's public ground, you have a right to protest without a permit. So a lot of people ask me, "Oh, do I need a permit for this?" Right? And I'm like, "No, of course you don't need a permit." Right? Like the thing is generally, and it varies by location, but generally you don't need a permit unless you're going to block a road or create what's called amplified sound. That means like a microphone, speakers, those sorts of things. So
Okay. Yep.
you don't need to get any permission from the government before you protest. So you should know that. And you are not required to let them know or anything, right? Now, so that's a right. Responsibility. You are not allowed to block off people's access. So if you're on a sidewalk, you have to let other people pass. You can't create a de facto barricade, right? Now, American sidewalks are unfortunately very thin. So how you this is probably our always our biggest point of negotiation with the police on site is, well, we have a thin sidewalk, we have a right to be on the sidewalk, but people also have a right to pass, so we have to make it kind of easy for them to pass while preserving our right to be on that sidewalk, right? But be aware of that. Obviously be aware of the right that speech is not a crime in the United States. I don't know if you have any listeners elsewhere, but pay attention to the rights you have elsewhere. But in the United States, speech is not a crime, right? And you can say really offensive things. Now, what I said earlier, remember my warning earlier. You may not be able to be criminally charged for speech, but you can still face other consequences, right? So if you chant something and say something that's very offensive, right, you can be subject to consequences from your employer, right? Like if you're at a protest and you're singing along to the recent Kanye West song, right? I would imagine
Yeah,
you will face consequences, and as
for
from your
sure.
employer, right? So you have every right to listen to that, and but be aware that I think a lot of employers would not want to employ someone who is singing along to those vile lyrics, right? So be aware that freedom of speech does not mean freedom from any consequences.
These are very good trinkets of nuggets of information. I agree to a lot of what you're saying. So let's transition a little bit more to the authoritative figures, and we'll start off with the people who have boots on the ground. Whether that's the police, whether that's ICE, the National Guard. Some of the key points that, or probably the biggest point that you referred to, is the aspect of de-escalation
Yeah.
and what that looks like. Can you explain that a little bit more detail? Like what should these people be doing to de-escalate?
Well, what the authorities need to do is understand that is give people a way out, right? So if somebody is swearing at you, right? So let's just say you're an agent, right? And somebody is swearing at you, calling you names, whatever, getting in your face. Well, you don't have to deal with somebody who's right in your face, but you can step back. Now, if the person keeps coming at you, you give them a warning, right? You say, "Hey, you need to stay. Do not get up in my face," right? Okay, if you continue to do this, there's going to be consequences, right? So rather than what I've seen in the videos. Now, again, I'm not saying that from the ICE agents. What I've seen in the videos is someone's kind of yelling in their face, and then boom, the tear gas comes out. Well, that's not
Mhm.
de-escalation. You want to give them avenues to retreat, right? If, for example, if protesters are blocking the road, right? Typically, a police situation will say, you need to get off the road, right? You're not allowed to be on the road. You have 30 seconds to get off the road, right? Okay, if you do not get off the road within 30 seconds, we're going to have to make arrests, right? So you're rather than grabbing the people, beating them up, and tossing them into a van. I'm not saying ICE did that. I'm saying that that would be a escalatory, right? You want to be de-escalatory, right? Arrests, when it comes to dealing with protesters, are a last resort. You want to give them every opportunity to leave, to extricate themselves before you resort to arrests.
When they're there, it's very important, and from my knowledge, that this training exists for like all these forces because there's a realization that you're engaging with people, and you never know what they have in mind. You never know what they're going to do. I remember in the military when I was taught in terms of like engaging with people, engaging with civilians, you always have to be like very respectful to them because they are the citizens, but you also be very conscious that anything could happen. So you
Of
don't
course.
want anything to happen. So you want to de-escalate as much as possible and to control the situation because that helps you as an officer. You
That
controlling
helps
the
you.
situation.
And that's why I strongly oppose the defund the police, because a lot of studies have shown that when police are outnumbered and don't have enough numbers, are probably the most likely to lead to a disproportionate use of force. Because if you have 20 police officers on site for a 200-person protest, that's probably fine. But if you have two police officers and there's 200 people getting up in your grill, right, then it might be more likely that a police officer kind of uses disproportionate force. So I really oppose the defund the police because I think when you have enough numbers, you're more likely to act rationally, rather than out of a fear of safety, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that the police, like, I very much have a huge respect for the authorities. I think they have a right. They have to balance three things. They have to protect the protesters' First Amendment rights. They have to protect the community from protesters who might have ill intent, right? And they have to protect themselves, right? So I understand that they have to do all of those things, right? And the thing is, local police have managed to do it very well. Now, what local police have often failed to do is when these protests have turned violent, again, nothing affiliated with us, but when protests have turned violent, they have often not used enough force in combating them, right? Like you mentioned the burning down of cities by BLM activists, right? That is an example of the police really did nothing, right? Like, look at what happened in Kenosha with Kyle Rittenhouse in Wisconsin. where no, there were no police at all on the scene when Rittenhouse was kind of engaged with these other folks, right? And it led to a vigilante scene, right? In a lawful country, we don't have vigilantism, but an absence of police presence actually breeds vigilantism, because if the police won't defend your property, then it then falls upon individuals to defend their property, and that individuals are more likely to use disproportionate force.
Yeah, there is a level of nuance in terms of finding the fine line in the involvement of these forces in these particular areas. The ultimate goal, and it's supposed to be hard at the end of the day, being a cop or being like these little authoritative figures for a reason. That's why they have a level of immunity too. That's why they have certain level of privileges, because they're here to protect the system, and
Yeah.
therefore they're here to protect the people who make up the system. That's
Yeah,
the
the
important
immunity
part.
protects them in good faith activity. So I think that I support immunity to the extent that it's involved in good faith actions, right? So to the
Mhm.
extent that there's good faith involved of, hey, we were trying to do our job, right? Um, I respect that. To the extent that this is some sort of ego and power trip, which is only the case with a very, very small number of officers, but I have seen it, right? On videos. I don't know to what extent that should apply, right? I want a very well funded, responsive police force.
And I'm there with you. Very well trained, very capable, here with good faith intentions to ensure that further violence doesn't happen. That's the people's idea, and that's their expectation. So when we see like crazy stuff that happen regarding ICE or any other force, the criticism is very much warranted, and we're seeing that reflected in the current like approval ratings in ICE in particular. So to start kind of talking about start wrapping up the conversation, so to speak, because you brought up a lot of very important and very like valuable information that I think is important to note from both sides of the aisle in terms of the people's responsibilities and the authoritative figures responsibilities on the ground. Now I want to go a little bit more into your organization and what you guys do and what you guys provide. So for you guys talked about the people you guys advocate for, but how does this really work in terms of like starting a protest, getting it organized? Can you give us the tips and tricks on? I know a lot of people will find this valuable because people are ready to protest right now more than ever. How do you start doing this stuff?
Well, so one of the big things, here's some advice in organizing protests, right? Um, Number one, and by the way, this applies more than just to protests. This applies to
Mhm.
any kind of advocacy, anytime you have to advocate for yourself. So maybe it's an insurance company that's overbilling you. Maybe you're dealing with your rent is late and you have to negotiate with your landlord to not evict you, right? Like these are all things that we all are called upon to be our own advocates in our lives, right? So, number one is identify the person who can actually help you, right? That's important. Identify who will actually be able to resolve your issue, right? So, let's just say use the issue of the landlord, right? Well, maybe the property manager cannot basically give you an extension of time to pay rent. Maybe it's the regional director, or maybe it's if your building is owned by some larger company. So find out who that is, and then okay, well, why would they give you? Because protests, a lot of us want to protest, but all of us have to advocate. So I'm going to just give you this advice, right? Um,
Okay.
okay, so you're dealing with this issue with your rent. Okay, well, maybe the regional director, you know, can has the authority to give you like an extension of your rent. But why would they do that? Well, a couple of reasons. Maybe you got a new job and you're going to be able to catch up, but you just need an extra few weeks or a couple months to catch up. Okay. And so that's the carrot, right? the stick is, well, if you don't cooperate, an eviction proceeding can maybe take a year and be really expensive depending on what state you're in, right? So on the one hand, they can do it the easy way, and you'll catch up, and on the other hand, they can do it the hard way, and uh they'll spend a lot more money, right? So maybe you have to make that case, but you have to make that case in a reasonable, respectful way to try to get that person to see things your way and give you what it is you're looking for, or come to some sort of arrangement, right? So it's important to think of it in those terms, because a lot of people are just thinking about it insofar as how it pertains to them, but they're not looking at who is the person who actually can help me, right? So if now we're talking about politics, and now we're saying, okay, well, let's just say you really oppose something Trump is doing, right? But then I see this all the time, but it's like, okay, we oppose Trump, so what we're going to do? We're going to protest the Portland City Council. Well, I don't think there are any MAGA Republicans on the Portland City Council, right? So why are you protesting them? Why are you not protesting a group that might be better able to come see things in your way, right? So I think a lot of times protest groups don't really focus on who has the power to help them, and they don't really make the case why they as protesters care, but they need to make the case for why you as an elected official, a CEO, a person in power should care.
Yeah, I think that's very valuable advice. Making sure that your protests are being poignanted, because it's kind of like I don't know what you would call it, but it's if a tree falls, does it make a noise if nobody's around? And this is kind of the same principle. You're protesting this random position. Maybe you want to convince your state or locale to change like their ICE operation in the area, and if you're not kind of protesting it in the right spot, then nothing is going to change. Nothing's going to happen. You're just going to be very loud. Dare I say, especially if people are just doing it for social media, then yeah, you get your clicks, but where's the policy change that's actually helping the people? I'm there with you. So after they do find the proper target, they do find the proper thing to go and protest or go and like a strike for, whatever it is. What's next? What's the best thing they should do in terms of like organizing the people, outreach? What are some tips there?
Well, find out. I would say try to convince people to go, right? And think about how you can get people to go, right? And to the extent, pardon me, and give people ways to participate, anywhere from attending a protest, which is really difficult, to making a couple calls, which is really easy, right? But the challenge is that attending a protest is really hard. I mean, that's why we're a company, is we make it easier for people to turn out protesters or to turn out to a protest, right? So it's really hard. Like randomly there are protests that end up being huge, but a vast majority of protests are like 2 people. Why? Because, each protest, I'm sure you've seen these demonstrations where you have like 5 people. A lot of those times there was a Facebook group where 300 people are RSVP'd to that protest, right? But 5 people show up, right? And that's just the reality with these sorts of things. One benefit of Crowds on Demand is we kind of give you that certainty.
Fair enough. Shout out Crowds on Demand. There's powers in visual numbers and powers in numbers in actuality in terms of what they're advocating for. Perception is reality, as they say consistently. With that said, we're about to wrap the podcast up. Do you have anything else you want to say before, or anything you want to plug before we wrap up today's show?
No, not at all. My only advice to your listeners is try to be your own best advocate, right? Stand up for yourself. Don't overplay your hand. My mom always said, know your leverage, right? And what is leverage? It's what is your power, right? Never overplay your hand and assume you're way more important than you are, but also don't underplay your hand. And even in your most helpless time, right? Like I said, facing eviction is probably one of the most vulnerable situations someone might find themselves in. I'm just giving that as an example. You still have power, right? Let's just say you don't have a job and you can't afford it. Even the terms of which you leave are negotiable. You have power, never feel like you're powerless.
All right, excellent. All of my guest Adam's information is in the description for people who are listening or watching back the podcast, the show. Of course, I thought this was a very interesting conversation. A lot of good insight in terms of the protesting, the do's or don'ts. I really do think the protesting Bill of Rights that you propose, it seems like this is the new trend, creating Bill of Rights with everything. I'm not mad at it. We all should have principles that we advocate for, that we
I
all can
want
get on the
more
same page for.
rights. I want more rights, not less rights. This is America. I want a lot of rights.
And I'm there with you. People need to be on the same page so we can create a better society for all of us. And I respect that you're focusing on both like what people should do and as well as these authoritative figures, because it takes two to tango, especially when a problem arises. So with that said, appreciate everybody who's listened to the podcast. If you are, rate the podcast 5 stars, share with your friends and family. You have a good one. Take care and peace.